It happened so fast I didn't even have time to scream. One moment I was walking home from my late shift at the diner, my backpack slung over one shoulder, my mind lost in tired thoughts. The next moment I heard it, a tiny, broken whimper coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze. It wasn't a sound I could ignore. It was raw, desperate. It sounded like someone dying. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scanned the shadows, the street lamps barely slicing through the thick night air. That's when I saw him. A small, trembling puppy soaked to the bone, his ribs sticking out from under filthy fur, a deep gash along his side glistening under the faint light. I stood there, paralyzed, as the rain started falling harder, washing little rivers of blood down the cracked pavement. For a heartbeat, I almost turned away. This wasn't my problem. I was already drowning in my own life, bills unpaid, fridge nearly empty, loneliness clawing at my chest every night. But something inside me broke wide open, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees, reaching out with shaking hands. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, my voice cracking. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't move. He just stared at me with those huge, terrified eyes, as if trying to decide if I was another person who would hurt him or finally, someone who would save him. I bundled him up in my jacket, ignoring the way the blood soaked into the fabric, ignoring the rain, the cold, the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. I ran. I ran through the streets, cradling him against my chest, feeling every tiny shudder of his broken body against mine. I didn't have a car. I didn't have money for an emergency vet. But I had legs. I had stubbornness. I had something burning inside me that said, "You don't leave him. Not tonight. Not ever." I kicked open the door of the only 24-hour clinic I knew of, gasping for air, my hair plastered to my forehead. "Please," I begged, slamming my palms on the counter. "Please, he's dying." The receptionist didn't ask questions. She shouted for help, and within seconds a team of people rushed him into the back, disappearing behind swinging doors. And I was left standing there, alone, soaked, bleeding, and praying harder than I ever had in my entire life. I didn't know it yet, but that night wasn't just about saving him. It was the night he would start saving me too. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and wet clothes. I sat there in the corner, shivering uncontrollably, my soaked jacket bundled around me, the puppy's blood still staining my hands. Every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a hammer against my skull. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind, the way he had looked at me, so small and broken, trusting me even when he had every reason not to. The receptionist brought me a cup of coffee at some point, but I barely noticed. I just stared at the double doors where they had taken him, willing them to swing open, willing someone, anyone, to tell me he was going to live. Finally, after what felt like hours, a tired-looking vet in blue scrubs came through the doors, pulling off her gloves. She walked toward me slowly, and I stood up on legs that barely worked. "He's stable," she said gently. "It was close, but he's a fighter. We stitched him up, started fluids, he's going to make it." I covered my mouth with both hands as a sob tore its way out of my chest. Relief hit me so hard I staggered back into the chair. The vet smiled kindly and added, "You saved him. If you hadn't brought him in when you did, he wouldn't have lasted the night." She asked me if I had a name for him. I didn't even think. The word fell from my lips like it had been waiting there all along. "Storm," I whispered. "Because he was born of the storm. Because he survived it. Because we both had." She nodded and wrote it down in the file. "Storm. My boy. My miracle." They kept him overnight for observation, and they let me sit with him for a little while before I left. He was hooked up to IVs, wrapped in clean bandages, but when I walked into the room, his head lifted weakly. His tail gave a tiny wag. I collapsed beside his cage, pressing my forehead to the cool metal bars, and whispered, "I've got you now. And I'm never letting you go." I didn't have a plan. I didn't know how I would pay the bill. I didn't know how I would take care of him. But none of it mattered. We had found each other. And somehow that was enough. The next morning, I was waiting outside the clinic doors before they even unlocked. My hair was a mess, my clothes still damp from the night before, but none of it mattered. I just needed to see Storm. The vet tech smiled when they saw me, ushering me inside without hesitation. There he was, lying in a soft bed, his side shaved and stitched, his little body still looking so fragile. But when he saw me, his whole face lit up. His tail thumped harder this time, banging against the side of the bed in steady, determined beats. I dropped to my knees beside him, careful of the 4 lines, and cupped his tiny head in my hands. His fur was rough under my palms, and he smelled faintly of antiseptic, but to me, he was perfect. The vet said he could go home with me that evening if there were no complications. "He's going to need a lot of care," she warned. "Medication, rest, clean bandages. And love. Lots and lots of love." I laughed through the tears that blurred my vision. That I said I can promise. They gave me a payment plan, one I could barely afford even with it stretched out over months, but I didn't hesitate. I signed the papers, emptied my bank account for the deposit, and promised myself I'd figure out the rest later. That evening, I carried Storm home in a cardboard pet carrier they gave me at the clinic. He whined a little at first, nervous, confused. But every time he whimpered, I slipped my fingers through the slats in the box, whispering to him, promising him over and over again that he was safe now. That he was home. Our apartment looked even shabbier than usual when I stumbled through the door with him. The peeling paint. The cracked linoleum. The leaky faucet dripping into the stained sink. But to Storm and to me it was a palace. I made a bed for him in an old laundry basket lined with every soft blanket I could find. I placed him gently inside and sat down next to him on the floor, refusing to leave his side even for a second. He struggled a little to get comfortable, wincing when he shifted, but eventually he curled into a tiny ball and fell asleep with a soft sigh. I watched him for hours, afraid to blink, afraid he might disappear if I looked away. That night, I slept on the floor beside him, one hand resting lightly on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. I had never felt so exhausted. Or so complete. We had survived the storm. Together. The days that followed were some of the hardest and most beautiful of my life. Storm needed constant care. I learned how to change his bandages, how to give him his medications without making him gag, how to lift him carefully when he was too tired to walk. He was weak, but every day I saw a little more of his spirit return. A little more spark in his eyes. A little more strength in the way he tried to follow me around the apartment, even when his legs trembled under him. He hated being still. Hated feeling helpless. I understood that better than anyone. I wasn't much different. I took extra shifts at the diner, coming home in the early mornings with aching feet and tired eyes, but every time I opened the door and heard Storm's soft bark, felt his warm, eager body press against my legs, the exhaustion lifted. He gave me something to come home to. Something to fight for. I had been drifting for so long, barely holding myself together with cheap coffee and fading dreams, but now there was purpose in every step. Every dollar I made went to his care first. Rent could wait. Food could stretch. Storm came first. Little by little he healed. His ribs filled out, his fur grew thick and glossy, and the gash along his side faded into a thin, silvery scar, a reminder of where we started. His personality blossomed too. He was stubborn, fearless, full of mischief. He would steal socks, bark at his own reflection, and try to climb onto the kitchen table if I turned my back for a second. I couldn't stay mad at him. I didn't even try. Every act of rebellion, every tiny bit of chaos was a miracle. Our bond became something unbreakable, forged not just by affection but by survival. He had trusted me with his life, and I had trusted him with my heart. Some nights, when the loneliness tried to creep back in, I would sit by the window with Storm in my lap, staring out at the dark city beyond, and feel a kind of peace I had never known before. I didn't have much. I didn't have money, or a perfect life, or a clear future. But I had Storm. And somehow that was everything. He had given me a second chance. And I would spend the rest of my life making sure he knew he was worth it. Every single day. Storm grew stronger and bolder with every passing week, and with his recovery came a fierce protectiveness I hadn't expected. It wasn't just that he loved me, it was that he saw himself as my guardian. If anyone came too close when we walked down the street, Storm would plant his little body between me and the stranger, growling low in his throat until they passed. If someone knocked on the apartment door, he would bark with such intensity that even the sketchiest neighbors thought twice before lingering too long. It was almost funny, this small, scrappy dog standing up against a world so much bigger and meaner than him. But to me, it wasn't funny. It was beautiful. It was proof that love, once earned, becomes the fiercest shield. Our life settled into a fragile kind of rhythm. I worked long shifts, scraped together enough to stay afloat, and every free second I had was for Storm. He became my shadow, my anchor, my constant reminder that even when the world tried to break you, you could choose to keep fighting. We spent lazy afternoons in the tiny park down the street, Storm chasing pigeons and barking triumphantly when they took off into the air. We made friends with the elderly woman who owned the corner bakery, who slipped Storm bits of pastry when she thought I wasn't looking. We built a life, piece by fragile piece. But even in the peace we carved out, danger never felt far away. Living in that part of the city meant you learned to keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your eyes open. You learned not to linger too long after dark. You learned to move fast and trust no one. I wasn't naive. I knew how quickly things could go wrong. I had lived it. I had survived it. And yet I let myself believe for a little while, at least, that maybe we had earned a break. Maybe the storm was finally behind us. Maybe life was done testing how much I could endure. I should have known better. Because one night, one breathless, shattering night, all of it came crashing down. And this time, the danger wouldn't just knock on my door. It would break it down. It started like any other night. I finished a brutal double shift at the diner, my body aching from carrying heavy trays and dealing with impatient customers. I tucked my tips, a sad handful of crumpled singles, into my pocket and headed home under a sky thick with low, bruised clouds. The streets were nearly empty, the city breathing slow and heavy around me. I kept my head down, moving quickly, one hand wrapped tightly around the strap of my bag. Storm would be waiting for me. That thought kept my feet moving even when exhaustion begged me to stop. When I reached my building, something felt off immediately. The hallway was too quiet. The air was too still. I hesitated outside my door, keys in hand, listening. Nothing. I shook it off as paranoia, the usual fear that came with living in a place like this, and slid the key into the lock. The door swung open too easily. It wasn't locked. My stomach twisted into a knot as I stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Drawers yanked open. Cushions ripped from the couch. My few valuables, such as they were, scattered across the floor. And then a sound, a low, vicious growl, snapped my attention to the far side of the room. Storm. He stood between me and two men rifling through my things, his body stiff with rage, his teeth bared. He looked tiny compared to them, almost laughable. If anything about the moment had been funny. But there was nothing funny in the way he stood ready to tear them apart to protect me. One of the men turned, cursing, and lunged toward me. Everything happened at once. Storm exploded forward, sinking his teeth into the man's leg with a snarl that didn't sound possible coming from such a small dog. The man screamed, trying to shake him off, but Storm held on, his body a blur of fury and loyalty. The second man grabbed for me, and pure instinct kicked in. I swung my heavy bag into his face, felt the satisfying crack of it hitting bone, and bolted for the door. Storm! I screamed. But he didn't let go. Even as they kicked at him, even as blood splattered across the floor, Storm fought like hell to protect me. I hesitated for one agonizing second, heart ripping in two, run and live, or stay and fight. I chose fight. Because Storm would have stayed for me. He was staying for me. And I would not leave him behind. Not ever. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a heavy ceramic lamp from the side table, and hurled it with all the strength I had left. It smashed against the shoulder of the man still trying to pry Storm off his leg. He shouted in pain, stumbling backward, and Storm finally released his grip, blood dripping from his jaws. Without missing a beat, he darted to my side, pressing against my legs like a living shield. The second man cursed and lunged for me again, but this time I was ready. Fueled by terror and adrenaline, I kicked out hard, my boot connecting solidly with his knee. He collapsed with a howl of rage, clutching his leg. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice cracking from the force of it. "Get out, or I swear to God." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Someone must have called the police. The men exchanged a panicked look, realized they were out of time, and bolted through the door, disappearing into the dark, crumbling hallway. I stood frozen for a moment, my chest heaving, my hands trembling so hard I thought I might fall apart right there on the blood-slick floor. Then I looked down at Storm. My brave, broken boy. He was bleeding. Limping. His sides heaving with exhausted, painful breaths. But he was alive. He had stayed. He had fought. He had saved me. I scooped him into my arms, ignoring the sting of his blood against my skin, and collapsed onto the couch, or what was left of it. I cradled him there, rocking back and forth, whispering over and over, "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." Maybe it was for him. Maybe it was for me. Maybe it didn't matter. We had survived. Again. The police arrived minutes later, guns drawn, shouting questions. I answered what I could, my voice hollow and shaking. They took photos of the apartment, of the blood, of the wreckage. They promised to investigate. They promised to patrol the building. Empty promises. I knew better than to expect anything real to come from it. After they left, after the landlord yelled about the mess and neighbors whispered in the hallways, it was just me and Storm again. Me and the only soul in the world who had never given up on me. The only soul who had bled for me. Fought for me. Stayed. I held him tighter as the night pressed in around us. No matter what it cost, no matter how hard it got, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would fight for him too. Until my last breath. The next morning, the apartment was cold and eerily silent, broken only by the occasional drip of a broken faucet and Storm's ragged breathing. I moved like a ghost, cleaning up the chaos from the night before with numb, mechanical movements. Broken furniture. Shattered glass. blood stains on the floor. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a crime scene, a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. I knew we couldn't stay there. Not after what had happened. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes sent fear skittering down my spine. This place wasn't safe. It never had been. I wrapped Storm in a blanket, careful of his injured leg, and packed a single duffel bag with whatever essentials I could grab. A few clothes. Storm's medication. His battered food bowl. The photo I had of us, taken just a month earlier, both of us smiling in the park, the sun catching the shine in his eyes. I tucked it deep into the bag, close to my heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We left without saying goodbye to anyone. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. We spent the next few days living out of cheap motels, the kind where no one asked questions and everyone kept to themselves. I used what little money I had left to pay for the rooms and Storm's vet bills. Watching him limp across those dingy motel floors broke something deep inside me. He was still fighting, still wagging his tail when I opened a can of food or scratched behind his ears, but he was tired. He hurt, and it was my fault. If I had gotten home earlier, if I had locked the door tighter, if I had lived somewhere better, the guilt chewed at me every second of every day. One night, after a particularly brutal coughing fit rattled Storm's small body, I sat on the floor of that tiny, stained motel room and cried until my chest physically ached. I buried my face in his fur, whispering apologies into the silence, promises that felt hollow and desperate. But Storm, sweet, unbreakable Storm, simply pressed closer, licking the tears from my cheeks with soft, patient strokes of his tongue. Forgiving me, loving me, telling me in the only way he knew how that I was enough. That we were enough. Even in the wreckage. Even in the dark. We still had each other. And somehow that was still worth fighting for. It was during those hollow days, drifting from motel to motel, that something inside me shifted. I realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. Scraping by, hiding, running, it wasn't living. And Storm deserved better than that. He deserved a home where he could heal, where he could feel safe again. And deep down, so did I. I didn't know how I would do it. I didn't have savings. I didn't have family to call for help. But I had stubbornness. I had grit. And most importantly, I had Storm, this tiny creature who had fought so hard for me even when the world had given him every reason not to. I started working double shifts, taking whatever jobs I could find. I cleaned motel bathrooms in the mornings, waited tables in the afternoons, stocked shelves overnight at a 24-hour grocery store. I barely slept. My hands blistered and cracked. My legs ached so badly at night that I sometimes cried silently into my pillow, afraid to wake Storm. But I kept going. Every time I thought about quitting, I looked at him, curled up in his little blanket, his tail thumping weakly when he saw me, and I remembered who I was fighting for. Slowly, painfully, things began to change. I scraped together enough money for a small deposit on a studio apartment. It wasn't much, just one room and a bathroom that barely worked, but it had locks on the doors, clean windows, and just enough space for Storm to have a bed by the heater. The first night we spent there, Storm walked the perimeter of the room carefully, sniffing every corner, every creak in the old floorboards. Then he circled 3 times and curled up at the foot of the mattress, letting out a deep, contented sigh. Watching him, I felt something crack open in my chest, a painful, blinding rush of hope. This wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to start over. A place to rebuild. Little by little, day by day, Storm regained his strength. The limp never fully left him, a permanent reminder of the price we had paid, but it didn't slow him down. He trotted through the neighborhood on our walks, head held high, ears perked, tail wagging like a battle flag. People smiled when they saw him. Kids waved. He was small, sure, but he walked like a warrior. And I realized, he was. We both were. We had survived the storm once. And now we were learning how to dance in the rain. Together. Always together. The days began to weave into something that almost resembled a real life. I picked up more stable work at a local bookstore, a cozy, old building that smelled like dust and dreams, owned by a kind woman named Evelyn who didn't mind that I sometimes brought Storm with me. In fact, she loved him. She set up a little dog bed behind the counter and left a water bowl out just for him. Customers adored him too. They would crouch down to scratch behind his ears while picking out their next novel or slip him little treats when they thought no one was looking. Storm became something of a local legend, the tough little dog with the crooked walk and the heart of a lion. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was ours. I saved every extra dollar I could. I fixed up the tiny apartment little by little, patching the cracked walls with cheap paint, finding furniture from thrift stores, adding small touches that made it feel like home. I even hung up the photo of me and Storm, the one I had tucked into the duffel bag that night we fled. Every time I looked at it, I remembered how far we had come, how much we had survived, how stubbornly we had refused to break. But underneath it all, I knew life could change in an instant. It always did. And no matter how much I tried to hold onto the good moments, a part of me waited for the next storm. It came one cold winter evening. I was closing up the bookstore alone, Storm asleep on his bed behind the counter, when I heard the bell over the door jingle. I looked up, expecting a customer who had lost track of time. Instead, I saw two figures in heavy jackets, their faces hidden under hoodies. My blood ran cold. Something about the way they moved, the way they stood, told me this wasn't about books. This was about something much darker. I reached down and touched Storm gently, waking him. His ears pricked up immediately, his body tense. The taller figure stepped forward, hands in pockets, voice low and rough. "Empty the register," he said. The other pulled something shiny from his pocket. A knife. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Not again. Not here. Not after everything. But before I could move, before I could even think, Storm was already in motion, standing between me and the men, growling low and steady. He didn't care about the knife. He didn't care about the danger. All he cared about was me. And this time, I wasn't going to let him fight alone. I could feel Storm's body vibrating with tension, every muscle ready to spring into action. But this time, I couldn't let him take the first hit. Not again. I raised my hands slowly, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was hammering so hard it made my ribs ache. "Look," I said, forcing calm into my words, "there's not much cash here. You can take it. Just don't hurt us." I moved behind the counter, hands in plain sight, and opened the old metal register. A few crumpled bills, some coins. Barely enough for a fast food dinner, let alone whatever they were desperate for. One of them cursed under his breath. "That's it?" His hand tightened around the knife. Storm growled louder, baring his teeth. He wasn't bluffing. He would launch himself at them if I gave even the slightest sign. I had seen him do it before, all heart, no hesitation. But I couldn't let him get hurt. Not again. Not for me. The door behind them suddenly swung open with a loud jingle. Evelyn. She had returned unexpectedly, her arms full of a box of donated books. She froze in the doorway, taking in the scene in an instant. The two men flinched, startled, off balance, and in that split second of chaos, Storm made his move. He shot forward with a speed I hadn't seen in months, going straight for the man with the knife. He latched onto the man's wrist, teeth sinking deep, forcing the blade to clatter to the floor. I didn't think. I grabbed the heavy metal stapler from the counter and hurled it at the second man's head. It hit with a sickening thud. He stumbled, dazed. Evelyn screamed for help, her voice echoing out into the empty street beyond. The first man kicked out violently, trying to shake Storm off. Storm yelped but held on, his jaws locked tight. Blood sprayed across the floor. I dove over the counter, grabbing Storm around the middle, yanking him back just as the man finally tore free and bolted out the door. His partner wasn't far behind him, still clutching his head. It was over in seconds. The bell over the door jingled wildly as it slammed shut behind them, leaving nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing, Evelyn's gasps, and Storm's low, rumbling growl vibrating against my chest. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching Storm to me, feeling his rapid heartbeat against my skin. We were safe. Again. Because of him. Because of the dog the world had thrown away. The dog who had every reason to give up on people but chose instead to love without limits. To fight without fear. To stay. The police came quickly this time. Evelyn had called 911 the moment the men ran, and within minutes flashing red and blue lights flooded the bookstore's windows. Officers took our statements, collected the dropped knife and promised, again, that they would do everything they could. I didn't believe them. Not really. But I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that Storm was still alive, curled against me with his tail thumping weakly every time I spoke. One of the officers, a younger man with kind eyes, knelt beside us and scratched Storm behind the ears. "You've got yourself a real hero here," he said quietly. I nodded, swallowing the thick knot rising in my throat. "Yeah," I whispered. "I know." That night, after the police left and Evelyn locked the door behind us, we sat together in the tiny back room of the bookstore. Me, Evelyn, and Storm wrapped up in an old quilt. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind only exhaustion and a bone-deep ache of gratitude. Evelyn made tea, her hands trembling slightly as she handed me a chipped mug. "You can't stay in that apartment," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "You and that brave boy need something better, safer." I wanted to protest, to say we were fine, that we'd manage. But I couldn't lie. Not to her, not to myself. Storm deserved better. I deserved better. We had fought too hard, survived too much to keep living like shadows. So I just nodded, clutching Storm closer, feeling the warmth of his small body seep into my frozen bones. Within a week, Evelyn helped us find a new place, a small cottage on the edge of town, a short walk from the bookstore. It was old and a little battered, but it had a fenced backyard, a fireplace, and more windows than I could count. Felt like a miracle. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. The day we moved in, Storm raced through every room, barking joyfully, his limp barely noticeable. He rolled in the grass outside, barked at butterflies, chased his own tail until he collapsed in a happy, panting heap. Watching him, I laughed until I cried. The kind of laughter that shakes something loose inside you, that fills the cracks you thought would never heal. For the first time in forever, we weren't just surviving. We were living, really, truly living. And we had built it, me and Storm, against every odd, against every storm life had hurled at us. We had built this life with nothing but stubborn hope and a love too fierce to die. And no matter what came next, I knew we could face it. Together. Always together. Life in the cottage felt like a dream I was afraid to wake up from. Every morning, sunlight spilled through the windows, bathing the worn wooden floors in golden light. Storm would stretch lazily beside me on the bed, his body warm against mine, before bounding to the door, ready for our morning walk through the sleepy, tree-lined streets. The neighbors waved to us now. Some even stopped to scratch behind Storm's ears and call him the little hero. I didn't correct them. He had earned that title 100 times over. Evelyn gave me more hours at the bookstore, and even helped me set up a small section where people could read to the rescue animals from a local shelter. Cats and dogs who, like Storm once had, needed someone to believe in them. Watching the kids curl up with a battered paperback and a wagging tail made my heart feel too big for my chest. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about healing, about rebuilding not just my life, but helping others rebuild theirs too. Storm, for his part, became a legend. People would drop by just to see him, dropping treats into his donation jar, taking photos with him. He wore a little red bandana now, embroidered with the words, "Second Chances Champion," and strutted around like he owned the entire bookstore. He had earned that too. At night, we would curl up together in front of the fireplace, Storm's head resting on my lap, the crackle of the flames wrapping the room in a cocoon of safety and warmth. I would read aloud sometimes, just for us, my voice steady and soft. He would listen with half-closed eyes, his tail thumping gently every so often like he understood every word. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the old fear clawed at me, when shadows from the past felt too close. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night gasping from a nightmare, heart racing, sweat clinging to my skin. But Storm would be there, pressing against me, steady and sure, grounding me back to the present. We had scars, both of us. We had stories that hurt to remember. But we were not broken anymore. We were warriors. We were survivors. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next disaster to take it all away. I was building something worth keeping. Something that could weather any storm. Because we had already survived the worst. And we had done it together. The seasons rolled by, each one stitching itself into the fabric of our new life. Spring brought rain that drummed gently on the roof while Storm snored softly at my feet. Summer brought long walks through wildflower fields, the two of us chasing fireflies under a sky thick with stars. Autumn painted the town in reds and golds, and Storm would bound through piles of crisp leaves, ears flying, barking with a joy so pure it hurt to watch. Winter wrapped everything in stillness, and we spent long evenings beside the fire, sharing warmth, sharing dreams. It was during one of those winter nights, curled up on the couch, that I caught myself staring at Storm longer than usual. His muzzle had started to gray. His movements had slowed. He still wagged his tail, still barked at the mailman, still leapt onto the bed with all the pride of a dog half his age, but the signs were there, small but undeniable. Time, as relentless as it was kind, had finally started catching up with him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Storm wasn't just my dog. He was my family. My anchor. The reason I was still here, breathing, living, hoping. And now, the thought of a world without him felt impossible. Unbearable. But Storm, sweet, stubborn Storm, didn't seem to care about time. He lived each day the way he always had, completely. Fiercely. With more heart in his tiny body than most people managed in a lifetime. Watching him chase snowflakes in the backyard that winter, his tail wagging furiously, I realized something important, something I think deep down he had been trying to teach me all along. It wasn't about how long we had. It was about what we did with the time we were given. It was about the moments, big and small, that stitched a life together. The early mornings and the quiet nights. The battles fought and the battles won. The love so deep it became part of your bones. Storm had never worried about the future. He had only ever cared about right now. About the people he loved. About the life he had fought so hard to have. And if he could face each day with that kind of courage, then so could I. No matter what the future held. No matter how hard the goodbye might one day be. Because love, a real love, doesn't die. It lives on. In every breath. In every heartbeat. In every second chance. That winter stretched on longer than most, the cold settling deep into the bones of the town, into the creaky walls of the cottage, into the edges of my heart. Storm still had good days, days where he raced down the hallway chasing a battered tennis ball, days where he barked at the delivery trucks like he was still the ruler of the block. But the tired days started coming more often too. Days where he slept for hours at a time, where he struggled to climb up onto the couch, where even his fierce little spirit seemed weighed down by something heavier than just age. I carried him when he needed it, bundled him in his favorite blankets, whispered all the stories of our life into his ear over and over, as if repeating them could somehow stitch time back together. I cooked for him chicken and rice, his favorite, even when I could barely afford groceries for myself. I canceled shifts at the bookstore when he had bad days, choosing him, always him, over everything else. People understood. They had always understood when it came to Storm. One night, as snow fell thick and silent outside, I found him sitting by the front door, staring out into the darkness. I knelt down beside him, wrapped my arms gently around his body, and rested my head against his. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the world hold its breath. I don't know how I knew, but something inside me whispered that we were nearing the end of our road together, at least in this life. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not yet. Storm had never given up on me. And I wouldn't give up on him, not now, not ever. I scooped him into my arms, carried him to bed, and curled up with him under the heavy quilt. His breathing was slow and steady, each rise and fall a prayer, a heartbeat, a memory. I traced the gray in his fur with my fingers, memorizing every inch of him all over again. And I whispered the same promise I had made the night I found him bleeding in the rain. I've got you. Always. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was true. And sometimes the truth was all we had to hold on to. Sometimes it was everything. The next morning, the world was covered in a thick blanket of snow, so white and untouched it looked like something out of a dream. I woke slowly, blinking against the pale light filtering through the window. Storm was still curled against me, his little body warm and solid, his breathing soft and even. Relief flooded through me. Another day. Another morning with him by my side. I moved carefully, not wanting to disturb him, and made my way to the kitchen to brew coffee, the old machine sputtering and groaning like always. I stood at the window watching the snow fall, hands wrapped around the warm mug, when I felt him. Storm pressing his head against my leg, asking for the simplest thing he ever asked for, to be close. I knelt down, setting the mug aside, and hugged him tightly. His body was thinner now, his strength less than it had been, but his heart, oh, his heart was as big as ever. We spent that day wrapped up together on the couch, watching old movies on the tiny TV, listening to the crackle of the fire. I fed him small pieces of chicken by hand, laughing when he growled impatiently for more. I told him every story I could think of, about the first night we met, about the time he stole a cheeseburger right off my plate, about the night he saved me from the two men in the bookstore. Every memory was a thread, weaving a tapestry of a life we had built from nothing but stubbornness and hope. As evening fell, the sky outside turned a deep, endless indigo. I carried Storm to our bed, wrapping him carefully in his favorite quilt, the one Evelyn had made for us when we moved into the cottage. He sighed deeply, settling into the warmth, his eyes fluttering closed. I lay beside him, stroking his fur, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat under my palm. And as the first stars appeared in the cold winter sky, Storm lifted his head just enough to nuzzle my chin, a final, soft kiss, before laying it back down against my chest. I stayed awake long after his breathing slowed and deepened, memorizing the weight of him, the smell of his fur, the way his tiny paw rested over my heart. Holding on to every second. Knowing. Feeling. Loving him with everything I had because somehow I understood that love, real love, was the only thing strong enough to carry us across the dark places. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Because no matter what came next, Storm had already taught me the greatest truth there was. That love survives everything. Even goodbye. I woke sometime in the middle of the night, the fire in the hearth reduced to a faint glow. The world outside was silent, the snow muting every sound. Storm was still curled against me, so small, so still. For a moment I just lay there, feeling the soft weight of him against my ribs, listening to the familiar, comforting sound of his breathing. But as I shifted to pull the blanket tighter around us, something inside me froze. The air was too still. His chest wasn't moving. I sat up fast, heart in my throat, reaching for him. His body was warm, but there was a finality in the way he lay there, peaceful, unmoving, like a breath that had been exhaled and never drawn back in. I pressed my hands to his side, desperate, trembling. Nothing. No heartbeat. No rise and fall. He was gone. I crumpled over him, the sobs tearing from me so violently I thought my body might split open. I held him tighter, tighter, as if I could somehow pull him back, as if love could stitch him back into this world the way it had once stitched me. But he was already free. Free of the scars, the pain, the battles he had fought so bravely for so long. Storm had left the world the same way he had lived in it, quietly, fiercely, completely on his own terms. He had stayed until he was sure I was strong enough to stand without him. Until he knew I wasn't just surviving anymore, but living. I stayed there with him until the first weak light of dawn slipped through the windows, washing the room in pale gold. I whispered every thank you, every I love you, every memory into his soft, still fur. I told him over and over that he had saved me. That he had built a life with me when there was nothing left but broken pieces. That because of him I knew I would never be alone again. When I finally stood, my legs shaking, I wrapped him carefully in the quilt he loved. The quilt filled with the scent of our life together, and carried him out into the morning. The snow crunched under my boots. The world was still. The world was grieving with me. And somewhere, in a place I couldn't see, I knew Storm was running free. No limp, no pain. Just endless fields and endless sky. And a heart that would never stop beating, not really. Because he lived inside me now. In every step. In every breath. In every stubborn, beautiful heartbeat that refused to give up. I buried Storm beneath the old oak tree behind the cottage. The one where he used to chase falling leaves and nap in the shade during lazy afternoons. I dug the hole myself. My hands raw and frozen, my body trembling with grief and exhaustion. Evelyn came by, bringing flowers and a blanket to wrap around my shoulders, but I barely noticed. I needed to do this with my own hands. I needed every blister, every aching muscle, every tear to be part of it. To honor him the only way I knew how. When it was done, I sat by his grave for hours, the snow falling silently around me, soaking into my jeans and hair and skin. I told him stories. I told him jokes. I told him about all the things we would have done together. Trips we never took, parks we never explored, adventures we would now have to share in different ways. I didn't know if he could hear me. Maybe he could. Maybe he was right there beside me, wagging his tail in that slow, steady rhythm that had once meant everything would be okay. I planted a small wooden marker at his grave, hand-carved and imperfect, just like our life together had been. I etched his name into it carefully. Storm. Loved. Forever. No dates. No finalities. Just the truth. Because love didn't have an expiration date. It didn't end with the last breath. It lived on, stubborn and beautiful, stitched into the places grief could never reach. The days that followed were slow, strange, heavy. The cottage felt too big. The silence pressed against the walls, thick and aching. I still reached for the leash every morning. Still glanced down at the empty spot by my bed. Still listened for the soft patting of paws that would never come again. Some days the grief knocked me flat, made it hard to breathe, to eat, to move. But every time I thought I couldn't bear it, I remembered how fiercely Storm had fought to stay alive. How he had looked danger and death in the face and stood his ground. He hadn't taught me how to avoid pain. He had taught me how to survive it, how to carry it, how to turn it into something stronger than fear. something stronger than sorrow. He had taught me that love was worth every scar, every ache, every goodbye. And because of him, I knew I would survive this too. Not just survive, live. Live fully. Live stubbornly. Live bravely. For him. For me. For the second chance we had built together out of nothing but broken pieces and unbreakable hope. Spring arrived slowly that year, hesitant and soft, like the world was grieving with me and didn't want to rush me forward. The snow melted away, revealing patches of green grass and the first stubborn flowers pushing through the thawing earth. I spent my days at the bookstore, stocking shelves, sweeping floors, talking to customers with a voice that trembled less with each passing week. Evelyn gave me space when I needed it and company when I couldn't ask for it. Some days were easier. Some were brutal. But always Storm was there. Not in body, but in memory, in spirit, in the way I moved through the world a little braver, a little stronger, a little more whole. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. At first, I wasn't sure I could handle it. The sight of so many broken, frightened animals. But the first time a skinny, shivering mutt crawled into my lap and sighed like he'd found safe harbor, I knew this was exactly where I needed to be. This was how I would honor Storm. Not by drowning in grief, but by pouring love back into the world, the way he had poured it into me. I told the shelter director about Storm, about our story. She cried when I told her. Then she offered me a position helping rehabilitate the hardest cases. The ones who bit, the ones who hid, the ones everyone else had given up on. I accepted without hesitation. I knew what it was like to be written off. I knew what it was like to fight your way back from nothing. And I knew, with every scar on my heart, that those were the souls most worth saving. Little by little, I found my way back to joy. It came in small, unexpected ways. A wagging tail, a new friendship, a letter from someone who had read our story and found the courage to keep fighting their own battles. I even started writing again, late at night when the house was quiet and Storm's memory wrapped around me like a warm blanket. Pages and pages of truth poured out of me, messy, painful, beautiful truth about love, loss, survival, and second chances. I realized that Storm's greatest gift wasn't just that he had saved me. It was that he had taught me how to save myself. How to love without fear. How to stay when it would be easier to run. How to believe stubbornly, fiercely that even the most broken heart could be mended. Even the loneliest soul could find a home. Even after the darkest storm, the sun would rise again. And when it did, I would be standing there. Stronger, wiser, ready to love the world a little harder, a little louder, in his name. Always in his name. Years later, on a warm spring afternoon, I sat under the old oak tree behind the cottage, the wildflowers blooming bright around Storm's grave. I leaned back against the rough bark, a book open in my lap, the sun soaking into my skin. The world around me was alive, birds singing, bees drifting lazily through the tall grass, the soft laughter of neighborhood kids carried on the breeze. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. It was everything I had once believed I would never have. I ran my fingers lightly over the carved letters of his wooden marker, Storm. Loved? Forever. The wood had weathered over time, but the words were still there, just like the love they marked. Unchanged. Eternal. Every year, on the anniversary of the night we found each other, I came here. I told him about my life, about the shelter dogs we saved, about the kids who learned to trust again because of his story, about the people who found hope when they thought it was lost. I told him about the days I still missed him so badly it ached in my bones. I told him about the days when I felt him beside me so clearly it was like he had never left. Because he hadn't. Not really. Storm lived in every second chance I helped give. In every broken soul who learned to love again. In every fierce, stubborn heartbeat that refused to give up. And he lived in me in the way I stood a little taller, loved a little harder, fought a little fiercer because of the lessons he had stitched into my soul. I closed my eyes, the sun warm on my face, and whispered into the quiet afternoon, "Thank you, Storm. For everything." A soft breeze stirred the wildflowers, carrying the scent of grass and hope and old, fierce love. I smiled, because I knew he heard me. I knew he was still here, still guarding me, still saving me, still loving me. Always, forever.